All right, guys, let's talk about economics. So, what is economics? Economics is about working with scarce resources, right? There's only so much in the world. People want everything, ideally, and they have to interact with each other. They have to work out, what does the other person have? What do they want? What can I get? Interactions with infinite wants. You want everything, ideally, and scarce resources. That's economics. And so then we think about, why do people form firms? How do firms act? How do workers interact with firms? How do customers interact with firms? How do firms and customers interact with governments? All the rest of it. So then the question is, well, how are we going to even start analyzing this? Because human systems are super complicated. There's all sorts of stuff going on. How are we going to make head or tail of this? We can't do a scientific experiment like in your chemistry labs at school because we're not just going to come along and tell 1,000,000 people, okay, can half of you do exactly this and half of you do the same thing, except we're going to change one thing to see what that one thing does. We can't do that. That would be a bit impractical and maybe a bit ethically dodgy, some would say. So we're not going to do that. And even if we did do that, it wouldn't be that interesting because it would only be telling us one thing. And we want to find out about how all sorts of things change it. How much does a 1% change in this tax affect things? How does a change in advertising regulation affect this? How does a change in worker regulation affect that? How does a change in technology affect interaction with workers and firms, etc.? All sorts of things. So what we do is we have theory, we have loads of theorizing and just thinking first principles, generally supply and demand. What can we guess is how things work? Pardon me. And then we go, well, how are we going to actually take this forward and investigate if what we reckon is true? And to do that, in the end, we use statistical tools. But what we often try and do is find examples of where one thing changed. So we're trying to do the controlled experiment, like in science, in a natural example, where it's been a bit like a controlled experiment. And we call this ceteris paribus, when you're the Latin ceteris paribus, when you're trying to keep everything constant except for one thing. So it's almost like an experiment if we can observe this happening in a real life situation. We call that a natural experiment because it's occurred without us having to force it on the world. So a classic example is in the 1980s from Cuba. The Cuban government went, we've got a load of criminals that we kind of want to get rid of. They're a bit of a pain. And some of them are just criminals, and some of them are actually political dissidents. They just didn't like the commies. And so what do? They chuck them on rafts and they send them off to sea. And the Americans go, I guess we'll take them in and we'll try and pitch it as a sort of freedom hurrah. And the question is, how does flooding 120,000 kind of often not even high school educated Cubans into Miami change the labor market? So typically you would think, oh, supply goes up, so we would expect the wages to go down because, more supply. There's the same amount of companies and whatnot at first. Maybe that would change over time, but we would expect in the short run it to hurt wages. What happens? And according to the really famous study on this, it actually didn't hurt wages. Although there was later another study saying that it did, and it's still all a bit confusing, but we won't go into that right now. The important thing is that's a great thing because it's a natural experiment. Nobody expected these immigrants to come. They weren't coming because suddenly job opportunities were better in this place, or because something else was getting better in this place, or something next door was getting worse. It was just because there was this isolated sudden change in policy from the Cuban government. So it's a great natural experiment. So that is a sort of broad introduction into how do we try and do things in economics. The problem is scarce resources, infinite wants. We've got to think about how that actually works out, how different economic agents like companies and workers and customers and governments interact. How do we investigate that? Well, we have to build our own models, our own theories about the world, and then we try and test them against natural experiments, or the more advanced you get, there's more statistics trying to control for things, but we don't really do that in A level.